Well, the saying goes that when it rains, it pours. Unfortunately for this project, it wasn't just a drizzle or even a soaking downpour, it was a full blown hurricane with my name on it. I'm still holding out hope that we can salvage something from the wreckage, but man, this one tested me. I kicked this project off a couple of months back, and from the very beginning, it felt like the universe was conspiring to throw delays at me. Schedules shifted, materials showed up wrong, and life just kept getting in the way. You name it, it happened. So after a long pause and a lot of anticipation, I finally made it back in the shop. And honestly, if nothing else, maybe walking you through some of my mistakes will help a few other poor souls from stepping in the same puddles. But enough of the woe is me, let's get to work. The goal here was to build a steam bent art piece, and I wanted to make something that was organic and really leaned into what steam bending is meant to do. My vision was a minimal wall sculpture with clean curves and balanced contrast. Think a quiet little piece that still has movement in life. Once I had all my big rectangles trimmed to size, I brought them over to the CNC to carve out the shapes for my forms. This is the part where I try to convince myself that I'm organized and efficient because I'm attempting to cut both the top and bottom halves of each form from a single sheet. It feels like a game of woodworking Tetris, only in this case the game over screen costs actual money rather than a restart. What I'm really doing here is making sure the material I remove from the center of the two forms matches the thickness of the strips I'll be bending later. When the forms clamp together, the space between them needs to perfectly match that thickness. If that space is off even a little bit, the curves won't hold correctly and the pressure won't be even. And then my art piece might look like something my dog dragged in from the yard. With all the parts for my forms sanded smooth, it was time for the glue up. And honestly, to save both of us from watching a bunch of glue slowly dry, we're just going to speed through it. All I did was laminate the plywood layers together and use a few 23 gauge brad nails to hold everything in place while the glue cured. Nothing too exciting here, just me, glue, clamps, and trying not to attach myself to the forms. Once the glue had cured, I pulled each form out of the clamps and took them over to the oscillating spindle sander. During the glue up, some of the plywood had shifted a little one way or another, so this was my chance to even things out and clean up those rough plywood edges. I'm just taking my time here and not getting carried away, because if I sand too much, the forms won't line up anymore. So it's a light touch, check the fit, light touch again, and try not to ruin everything I just glued together. Next up, I gotta nail down the actual length of my work pieces. And the easiest way to do that is with a sewing ruler because it can bend and conform to the curves of my form. I'm keeping the pieces oversized for now, so after the steam bending's done, I can just trim everything back to the final length I'm going for. From there, I'm gonna start milling down my lumber. For this piece, I want to use both walnut and white oak since they have a ton of contrast and look pretty awesome together. So on my first pass, I went ahead and milled everything down and prepped it for bending. I'm shooting for a 1/2 inch here since I've had some pretty good luck steam bending at 1/2 inch. But even with that, you've got to be really picky about the boards you choose. You want the grain to run nice and straight, and you want to avoid big cathedrals, checks, or any little cracks. Those flaws will absolutely split during the bend, and as you're about to see, I ran into that exact problem. So, unfortunately, during the milling process, I noticed that this is cracked and checked right here, which means that the likelihood of this surviving the steam bending is very low. So, the other downside to this one is that it's got a lot of cathedrals through it. It's fairly straight, but I want to see if I can find something a little bit straighter, like in this piece, which is why I went with this board. I'm gonna head to the lumberyard now and see what they have and see if we can find something that's straight like this without the checks. So over at the lumberyard, I ended up calling a full audible and grabbing something a little more exotic in Osage. Osage has super straight grain and it's crazy dense, and my brain went, hey, if you can bend maple, you can probably bend this too. So I went ahead and milled it down, not realizing that I was wasting both time and money. I will say the grain and texture on this stuff are awesome, but when it comes to steam bending, it's just not the right choice. You live and you learn, and in this case, I learned that Osage is about as bendy as a brick. So I went ahead and set up the steam box, unknowingly walking straight to my doom. I let the steam box get up to temp at about 210 degrees, then loaded in both the walnut and the Osage. I let the lumber steam for about 35 to 40 minutes, then cracked open the box and started my first bending attempts. I picked up a couple of clamps that allow me to use an impact driver to really tighten them down and hope that they would give me enough leverage to squeeze my workpieces into submission. I did have to loosen and retighten clamps multiple times, so it was a bit of a dance to get everything squeezed together. Pretty quickly, I realized things probably weren't going to go the way I hoped. But I kept pushing forward with my proverbial fingers crossed, and to my dismay, the problems just kept stacking up on me.
No, we ain't gonna be able to make this work. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. I think I lost.
So round 1 went to the lumber, and I decided to split things up for round 2 and switch over to some white oak. I know white oak usually behaves a lot better with steam bending, so it felt like the safer move. I headed over to the bandsaw and resawed my slightly oversized workpieces down into 1/4-inch strips to give it another shot. I also noticed I was getting some impressions from the edges of the plywood in my first attempt, so I added some cork to the forms to help smooth out those pressure points. After that, I tossed the 1/4-inch strips into the steam box and let them chill, or I guess sweat, for about 20 minutes. From there I pulled them out and went right into the whole bending and molding routine. I'm not gonna lie, I felt pretty confident about this round. But the woodworking gods were still very much against me, because after letting the forms sit overnight, I came back into the shop, pulled the forms off, and found more cracked sections. Like any good woodworker, I muttered a few choice words under my breath while I tried to figure out what to do next. I had really hoped that steam bending was going to be the answer for this project, but after failure after failure, I finally had to throw in the towel and head in a different direction.
Alright, as much as I hate to admit it, it's been a few days and both of my pieces have kind of sprung back. In fact, they've sprung back so much that they're almost the same shape now. So I'm not really happy with the results I'm getting from the steam bending on this specific application. So I'm going to clean this up, pivot a bit, and see how we can make this work for the project that I have envisioned. So unfortunately, this one's a loss.
So let's pivot to a real winner and check out the sponsor for today's video, Brunt Workwear. Now, if you're like me, you spend a ton of time on your feet. And let's be honest, walking around on hard concrete floors can do a serious number on your back and your soul, literally and figuratively. Luckily, that's where Brunt has you covered. They offer a ton of different boots in various styles and safety features, but most importantly, they're tough, and they focus on comfort. The boots you see here are the Omen Soft Toes, and funny enough, they were actually designed by a woodworker named Lee Omen, specifically with spending long hours in the wood shop in mind. They are super lightweight and water resistant, though Brunt has plenty of waterproof models in their lineup if you need them. I've used a few different variations of Brunt boots over the years, and I've genuinely never been let down by a pair. So if you're interested in stepping up your boot game, use code TimberBiscuit10 and get $10 off your first purchase. Go ahead and try them on the job, and if you don't like them, just send them back. Links in the description. Thanks again to Brunt for sponsoring this video. So as I mentioned before, it was time for a new approach, and that brought me over to bent lamination. First thing I gotta do here is tape off my forms so the laminations don't glue themselves right to the form and turn this into an even bigger mess. I'm pretty sure bent lamination is the right call for this project because the curves in my forms were just a little too aggressive for steam bending, especially with all that back and forth movement. I still really wish the steam bending would have worked out, and I'm definitely going to revisit it again in the future. But for now, we're on a new path, and hopefully the mistakes I just slogged through help at least one of you avoid the same headaches. So the new material of choice is hard maple, and once I got it milled down at the jointer and the planer, I headed over to the bandsaw to resaw my pieces down to 3/32 of an inch. I want my final work pieces to end up at about a 1/16 of an inch thick, so adding that extra 32nd gives me a little wiggle room to clean everything up later. Oh, and while we're here, here's another bandsaw thought. Funeral homes keep raising the cost of services and continue to blame it on the cost of living. That's definitely some irony. So with my thinned out ribbons in hand, I headed over to the drum sander to give them that Ozempic treatment. And just as a little side note, if you're shopping around for a drum sander, definitely don't buy this one. It's not a great experience. Now, on the other hand, if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe. It really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. So after half a dozen or so tripped breakers, my thin tree slices were finally ready for their sandwich debut. When it comes to making laminations, I usually bounce back and forth between PVA glue and epoxy. For this one, I'm going with epoxy because it cures way harder than PVA glues, and I think it's going to hold the shape a lot better in the long run. So over at the assembly table, I went ahead and mixed up my epoxy. From there, I rolled out a small slab and then applied the epoxy to one side of my strips using a foam roller. Once the roller was loaded up, I started working down each strip, making sure every square inch had a good, even film on it. The goal is to get everything coated before the epoxy starts to set, so it gets a little hectic. You can kind of think of it like spreading peanut butter on a stack of noodles while the clock is ticking. But once they're all coated, it's go time. Everything has to get stacked, aligned, and clamped into the form before the epoxy starts warming and turning into a rock. To help keep my pieces from slipping side to side, I like to use a few strips of blue tape. And thankfully, as I started to tighten things down this time, I didn't hear any cracking or splitting like I did with my previous few attempts. Instead, it was just that sweet, sweet whisper of clamps locking in place. And don't fret, this time I'll omit the sections of the impact driver cranking away. You're welcome. With both of my laminations clamped up in the forms, all that was left to do was let them sit overnight. So the next day, I headed back into the shop, popped the clamps off, and finally got to see how everything turned out. And this time, I was stoked. The forms held perfectly, and I didn't have a single crack, check, or void hiding in the laminations. So after what felt like a lifetime of failures, we're finally on to the next step. And the next step is just cleaning up the edges and getting everything nice and even. To do that, I'm grabbing a couple of hand planes and giving these ribbons a quick spa day to smooth them out and square them up. My number 4 smoother is probably my favorite hand plane to use in the whole shop. And it actually got me wondering, what's your favorite hand tool to use in your shop? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, if you start your comment by naming your favorite hand tool, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. So with the edges all cleaned up, I can move on to the face grain. I'm going to do the majority of the work with an electric sander, but there are some tighter curves that the palm sander just can't reach, and for those, I'll move to hand sanding. Here, I'm just careful not to remove too much material, otherwise I risk exposing those laminated layers. And once I was happy with the surface, I marked out my 2 ends and trimmed my ribbons down to length over at the bandsaw. Cleaning up the ends of these laminations can be a little tricky, so I like to start by knocking down the saw marks with the sanding block. Once that's handled, I come back in and really smooth things out with a block plane. After I was happy with the finish, it was time to mark out the notch where the 2 ribbons are going to overlap. Now I'm not going to lie, this part of the build was one of those more intimidating ones. I had to cut the notch by hand and make sure that both pieces lined up perfectly, because if the alignment is off even a little bit, the whole visual effect falls kind of flat. And since both my ribbons are curled, getting that notch placed dead center is not nearly as simple as doing it on 2 flat boards. So once I got my bird's eye view on things, I went ahead and finished marking out my workpiece. Since these lines aren't perfectly square across both faces, I gotta be careful when I cut this section out. I'm basically trying to stay inside my layout lines the whole time, so I don't blow past the mark and ruin the fit. So once I had all my marks in place, there was no turning back. All I had to do now was grab my pole saw and stay the course. This is one of those make or break moments in a project like this, because if I mess this up, there's really no way to fix it without going all the way back and making new laminations. And I'll be honest, that thought alone is enough to get the heart rate up a little. Anytime I get into these kinds of cuts, it is a little stressful. especially now that I'm at the age where seeing these kinds of lines is a bit trickier. I'm not at the stage where I'm taking pictures of instructions and zooming them in on my phone, but I can feel that day creeping up on me. Just a bit outside. With the cuts in place, I flipped the workpiece over, grabbed my chisels, and got to work cleaning up the joint. I started by marking the edges so my chisels had a clean place to register, then from there I just tapped away until everything lined up the way I wanted. I'll show you a quick summary of the process, but trust me, this took me a good while. As you can imagine, there was a lot of tap, check, tap again, question my life choices, and then finally sneak up on the fit. So, after what seemed like a never ending process, it was finally time to bring the joint together, and I was pleasantly surprised when everything fit snugly with no large gaps. The next step was creating the background for the sculpture. For this part, I pictured a really flowing design that kind of wraps around the ribbons and helps to show off the curves I worked so hard to make. I didn't want just a flat board behind everything. Instead, I wanted something that felt like it belonged with the movement of the ribbons. Almost like the background and ribbons are having a conversation rather than fighting with each other. I also wanted the whole thing cut from a single board so the grain runs right through the entire piece. That continuous grain pattern is one of those small details most people won't consciously notice, but they'll feel it. It makes the whole sculpture look more cohesive and intentional. If I pieced together a few boards, you'd get little grain breaks or color shifts, and it would interrupt the flow of the design. Cutting it from one board just elevates the whole look and makes the background feel like part of the art instead of just something holding the ribbons in place. Once I had the pieces roughed out at the bandsaw, I took them over to the workbench to sand back to my line. This is another time-consuming process where I had to go back and forth between testing the fit and seeing where my curves needed material removed. The idea is to take this process slowly because you can't add material back once it's removed, so spoiler alert, there's another problem incoming.
Well, in sticking with the theme on this one, I've made another mistake. I sanded too far in this corner, which means I'm gonna have to remake all three of these parts if I want that continuous grain pattern to flow through the entire piece. So I'm probably not gonna film the whole thing. So I'm gonna remake these guys and I'll pick up where we left off, which is gonna be right here.
With my background pieces recut, I decided to use my spindle sander to give me more control over my final shaping. The downside is I have to pay a bit more attention because I can remove a lot more material a lot more quickly. But the upside is that it's much more accurate. So after a few bumps in the road, it was finally time to get this thing reassembled and test the fit. And thankfully this time everything came together the way it was supposed to. Once I saw that everything was sitting where it belonged, it was finally time to move on to the glue up. The glue up for this piece was pretty straightforward. Once I figured out where all the clamps needed to go, all I had to do was brush some glue into the joints and squeeze everything together. I ended up breaking it into two separate glue ups so I could shift the clamps without them crashing into each other, but it was nothing fancy. Just a little patience and a lot of clamping pressure. Once the glue had dried, I could move on to applying the finish. And for the finish on this piece, I'm going with my tried and true Rubio Monocoat. So to prep the surface for finish, I first need to break all my hard edges and sand down any glue squeeze out. I'm also going to make sure to take all my surfaces up to 180 grit so that I'm left with a really smooth finish. Once the debris is removed, I can go ahead and apply my finish. So, as many of you know, I work on these projects on nights and weekends, and having the support from you guys means the world. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into it here, but if you guys would like to support the channel further, I'll leave a link to my Patreon down in the description. And if you can't join today, no sweat, thanks again for watching and commenting on the videos. So, with the final swipes of the shop towel, the finish is done, and we're finally ready to roll into the beauty shots. This project has been a wild one. I started out thinking steam bending was going to be the hero of the story, and instead it tried to take me out at the knees. I fought cracked boards, bad lumber choices, shifting forms, and more curveball moments than I cared to admit. But switching over to bent laminations completely saved the day. Once I got the forms dialed in, the laminations cleaned up, the joints cut, and the background shaped from one continuous board, everything finally started to click. And it turned into the piece that actually shows off the wild curves I had in my head from the start. If nothing else, this one taught me a ton and hopefully saves you from making the same mistakes I made along the way. So if you enjoyed this journey and you're ready to go on another, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And as always, I knew this would work, kinda, and I'll see you next time.